good afternoon, and welcome back to Climate Change Seminar. So I'd like to begin by, again, acknowledging the Cornell Atkinson Center for the support of the seminar series. So today is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Brittany Schmidt, who's currently an associate professor at Georgia Tech. However, Brittany will be taking a joint position in astronomy and Earth and atmospheric science here at Cornell, and just told me she's coming up here this summer. So Brittany received a PhD in geophysics and space physics from UCLA, and the great majority of Brittany's publications and research concerns planets and moons other than Earth's. Ultimately, Dr. Schmidt aims to understand how icy worlds form, evolve, and could give rise to life, and Jupiter's moon Europa is a primary example of such an icy world. Here on Earth, Brittany's research as to how an ice and water interact helps to improve our understanding of both Europa and other icy worlds on our own planet. The use of imaging and geophysical techniques is a common thread of her research. So as such, Brittany will talk to us about explorations of Antarctica, where Icefin, a small under-ice robotic oceanographer, has been used to constrain oceanographic conditions and provide information on the stability of the Antarctica ice sheets, amongst other valuable information. So thank you, Brittany, for coming and talking to us, and look forward to your talk.
Thanks. And I'm excited to give it. So it's nice to be joining you here virtually and hopefully very soon physically at Cornell. I'm really excited to be joining the faculty in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences as well as astronomy. So that's gonna be really kind of fun. New adventure for me and my research group. So I gave some of this as a talk when I was interviewing, and it's come a little bit further since then, but it's still a little bit of a work in progress. The stuff I'll show you today isn't yet published. It's in draft form and hopefully going to be published fairly soon. So that'll be really exciting. But anyway, I'm really thrilled to be here. So thanks so much. Are you guys seeing my screen okay?
I think it looks good, except maybe it's not full screen. There's some things along the bottom.
Is that better?
That looks good, yeah. Great.
So so the talk is going to focus on data from this vehicle here. So this is Icefin, which is our protoplanetary probe, but also really designed to do Earth science. So it's an instrument that we developed in my lab at Georgia Tech, starting when I first got here. It's now been to Antarctica several times and is kind of a fun new development. So I'm really thrilled to talk about it. Just to set the stage for why I was really excited to do this work at Cornell and why it might, have some resonance with folks there is kind of this new, or maybe not new focus, but a focus on preparing the next generation of global citizens. And I liked this idea of a culture of broad inquiry throughout and beyond the Cornell community. So when I think of, global problems and a global mindset, climate change and sea level rise are at the forefront of that, because it's much like the scenario that we're in right now that was very rapid and very real. It's one of these challenges that faces everyone, no matter if you're located in New York or Georgia or the United Kingdom or Antarctica or the Pacific Islands. And so this theme of broad inquiry is also something that really, I think, resonates and is very important for this type of a problem, because it requires perspectives from so many different types of people: engineers, scientists, social scientists, policymakers, because it takes that number of people in order to kind of address such a challenge. And so I'm excited to kind of continue to work on this when I get up there. This picture right here is kind of a representation to me of our role in that. And there's probably, this looks kind of a grainy picture of whatever, but let me kind of walk you through what this actually is. And I think of it as our I often say it's like our walking on the moon moment, at least for our research group. And what this is a picture of the shape of the ice at the grounding zone of a major glacier. So the way Antarctic glaciers work is essentially you have compacting snow creating ice sheets, and those eventually grow too large and they kind of overflow the continent. As they overflow the edge, or as they slide off the edge of the continent and start to enter the water, the place where they go afloat is called the grounding zone. So it's grounded and then it is floating on one side and grounded behind it. So the grounding line is the place where those two make a connection. And until pretty much this picture in this set of dives, we actually didn't have comprehensive data from any grounding zone anywhere in Antarctica. A few pictures, a few discrete data points here and there, but nothing really significant and nothing for a rapidly changing system. So this is a picture of the shape of the ice underneath Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica, which I'll talk about for most of the rest of the talk. And what it represents is really that getting to this place where we had no knowledge and now at least have some. And I hope to convince you that our changing perspective of what this means is really what we needed to know that we didn't know to begin with. So we'll talk a little bit about this, but what you're looking up here is the shape of the ice. So this is actually ice. All of that brown material is actually material that is frozen on or basically worked up into the glacier when it's over the ground. So it picks up dirt and rocks, it picks up sediments from inside liquid pockets that are on the continent, and then that kind of gets flows with the ice. And so you're actually seeing kind of streaming lines here. You're seeing little rocks that have been picked up, and then you're seeing the shape of the ice, this kind of curvature here with some sharper features. And then right back here is actually where the ice is sitting on the continent. So it's right before it's coming out. So this is like hours old ice. It's been in the ocean for hours, which is really, really kind of neat. If you wanted to be convinced that it's ice, you can actually see the highly reflective bits right here. So most of this is actually clear with little particles inside of it. So we'll talk a lot about what this means at the end of the talk. This is probably what you're used to thinking about when you see Antarctica. So it's a really amazing place. I've been lucky enough to go down there 7 times now, hoping for number 8 this year. Most of our work has focused on the Ross Ice Shelf. So you can kind of see in this map of Antarctica, you can see the Transantarctic Mountains sticking out. You can see these low-lying flat areas. Those are the ice shelves. So this is the place where the ice sheet kind of flows over its borders and stitches itself out across the ice. The Ross Ice Shelf, for reference, is about the size of France. So it's a huge amount of ice. It's about anywhere from 100 meters to maybe 30 meters thick on this frontal edge of the ice shelf. When you get to the back, it's closer to 1,000 meters. We've also been doing some work here. Thwaites Glacier, which is the picture I just showed you, is from this Thwaites embayment. So the ice shelf itself is out here, but this whole glacier system is the really important part, and it's draining part of the continent. So West Antarctica is kind of everything west of these Transantarctic Mountains, and East Antarctica is kind of out over here. West Antarctica is the really rapidly changing part of Antarctica, though none of it is actually changing very slowly. And so we'll be talking a little bit about what each of those effects have on sea level rise. So something else that's kind of special about Antarctica, and particularly about some of the ice shelves, is its position at the southern hemisphere, which actually isolates it oceanographically and to a certain extent as atmospherically from the rest of the planet. And so that actually is pretty important. But the formation and exchange of water masses between the Arctic and the Antarctic and this whole global overturning circulation that happens throughout the Earth's oceans still has a really important role to play in Antarctica. One of the really key things that's happening is this really deep water here, circumpolar deep water, is actually warming pretty consistently because it comes from warmed surface waters eventually get involved in the production of CDW. And so as this layer of the ocean has been warming, that slowly warming, but still warming water is actually getting pushed up onto the continent. And so the circumantarctic current's kind of working its way around, which means that part of Antarctica is directly hit by this kind of upwelling water. Some of that water is directly upwelled underneath part of the ice shelf. But for places like in the Ross Sea, there's not as much of this warm water being advected all the way to the grounding zone. But in the area around Thwaites Glacier and the Antarctic Peninsula, which is the places that we're seeing the most extreme change going on, this action of warming circumpolar deep water being upwelled onto the continent and onto the continental shelf is partially responsible for what we're seeing as this rapid change in Antarctica. So this oceanographic circulation plays a really important role in what we see. It's not just surface melting, and it's not just a top-down picture. You have to think about what's coming up from underneath the bottom. From the top, though, this is expressed in ice stream velocities as one of the key ways that we talk about it. So this is a relatively older picture, but it kind of gets the point across that the fastest moving ice is generally right up at the top of relatively higher mountains, or it is in these ice streams. So right as the ice starts to slide over the continent, kind of coming down the slope, and then at the middle part of ice shelves. So all of these blues and purples are ice streams and ice shelves. You can see they're like rivers of ice essentially, and then you build these massive floating shelves. And then the fastest moving ones is still pretty accurate. These exact numbers is not completely correct, but Pine Island is this system here. The Thwaites ice shelf is here, and then there's Dotson and Crossan that are down in this area. But you can see that these kind of bright reds and purples really stand out in this part of the continent. There's been a lot of change along the peninsula, but you can see it's very isolated. The reason that we're worried about this particular system is because it's this combination of fast flowing ice, upwelling ocean water, and atmospheric change all in this area, and it being a little bit lower latitude. And so in this place, there's this kind of perfect storm of change that's affecting the glacier, and the impact of that is particularly high in West Antarctica. So the way an ice shelf system kind of works in cross section, I've been kind of alluding to this, is that you build an ice sheet up on the continent. It starts to kind of overflow, and it flows down through a fjord or through an ice stream into the ocean, producing this big flat ice shelf. At the same time, you have interactions from sea ice at the front that can create a melange that kind of buttresses the ice shelf. And the ice shelf itself, if it's stitched to pinning points like a rock out in front, or other glacier systems coming in, or the walls of a fjord, then it actually acts as a backstress on the ice that's upstream. So all the ice that's sitting up on the continent is also receiving a backstress from the dynamics of the ice shelf. If the ice shelf goes away, then there's really kind of an unfettered flow into the ocean. So we actually worry about that. That concept is called the marine ice sheet instability, and it essentially describes how warm circumpolar deep water or other warm water, if it gets back to the grounding zone. So now we've got the ice shelf floating out here. This is that circumpolar deep water that I said is warming slowly but measurably in our warming climate. This is being pulled up underneath the ice shelf. And then as it gets back to the grounding zone, depending on the circumstances at the grounding line, this entire system might be unstable. And the way to think about it is that if you melt the ice shelf here and you move this grounding zone position, now there's a bunch more ice sitting on top of the same position. So the total flow into the ocean is increased. So then that tends to mean that this is all going to move faster, and then this is going to melt faster. So you get this kind of feedback. So you melt it back, which increases the speed, and you continue melting, which increases the speed further. And that's known as the marine ice sheet instability. But whether this is going on, or exactly how that works, and whether it works or not, has been kind of unclear. It's been theorized, has been talked about for 20 years, but direct measurements of the processes that drive it have been a bit more elusive. And so that's kind of the focus of a lot of the work that we've been doing. The picture that I was talking about for Thwaites Glacier becomes more clear when you look at it this way. So in the earlier pictures, you saw the ice sheet sitting up on top. Here, what you're seeing is essentially the topography. So there's the Transantarctic Mountains again. Here's the Antarctic Peninsula. Here's East Antarctica. You can see that there's a, that there's a continent underneath there. That is above sea level. The hard part for West Antarctica is that though there's a massive ice sheet there right now, most of it is actually grounded well below sea level. And so when we're concerned about change in West Antarctica, it's because of this. It's because if the ocean can access these cavities that are actually grounded below sea level, right now they're kind of held back by these forward grounding zone positions. But as that becomes possible, it means that this acceleration can basically get out of control, and you could lose the West Antarctic ice sheet or most of it very quickly. So Thwaites Glacier is actually controlling what happens right here. So these are two kind of ways of looking at change in the Thwaites Glacier. So this is kind of ice flow speed in meters per year. So it's very, very fast out on the ice shelves. And then you can see kind of the flow of the ice coming from the inner part of the ice of the catchment and then flowing towards the grounding line, which is right out here. But you can also see that there's a combined elevation change. So it's not just moving faster, it's also deflating. So you're actually losing meters per year in ice thickness. As the ice speeds up, you're basically pulling more ice across the grounding line. It's thinning dynamically, as well as potentially being melted. So trying to resolve what exactly is going on here is of pretty key importance. And the reason for, sorry, I should have been a bit more clear. The reason this is so important is that it might be like, okay, well, we lose a bunch of ice in here. But if you were to like kind of draw a line, this dark line here is basically all of the ice that drains across the grounding zone of Thwaites Glacier. If you suddenly removed all of that ice, you're talking about around a 3-meter global sea level rise, just from this one system. And notice that it's not isolated. There's lots of other ice that would be lost along with that system. So this is just the largest amount of ice loss that is held by one system, is this kind of 3 meters of sea level rise that could destabilize this entire ice sheet. And that's why we think of Thwaites as being really important. Even if you didn't have that data on the grounding zone changing or the thinning, you could see this in spacecraft data. So this is an image of satellite data showing how the glacier has changed. So we'll run through it one more time. So this is 1988. We've got an ice tongue and it's growing. 1997, the ice tongue's growing again. It had been relatively stable like this for a while. Then in 2003, this massive chunk of the ice tongue starts to break off. But the stress from that kind of propagates backwards and the whole ice shelf disintegrates. And so this massive ice shelf that had always existed coming out of the main trunk of the glacier has essentially disintegrated in the last 10 to 20 years. And what's left is just this piece. And the reason it's left is because there's a pinning point out here. So there's a little, basically a sea mount or a rise that the ice is kind of parked on, and it's only partially stably parked on that. So this is just, even if you didn't have all of the other sets of data telling you that there was change going on here, just from images of the glacier, you can see this massive amount of loss from this once solid sheet. And there was a time at which these islands would have been connected, these two peninsulas would have been connected by an entire ice sheet that was Pine Island plus Thwaites plus Crossan and Dotson. And so the fact that we're now down to just some tiny pieces of the glacier left is somewhat concerning, given its effect. Here's another way of looking at that. Sorry, everybody picks a different perspective view. Now the glacier tongue is to the bottom, and the grounding line is this line that's kind of been traced along here. And what these bubbles are showing you is just how far back the grounding line is moving on average every year. So what it's saying is that each year the position of the floating part of the ice is moving backwards by a certain amount. And you'll see it's pretty huge, kilometers per year. It means that it's moving very rapidly inland to where these unstable slopes might be. You can also see in this picture, the contours here is that it gets much, much deeper just behind this grounding line. So right now there's a bunch of kind of hills underneath the ice on which the ice is predominantly grounded. Once it gets past there, then we go into this kind of retrograde slope where it's just going downhill after that. So the ocean is getting into a place that's lower elevation and it can embay. And so that's really the kind of the worry we have here, is starting to connect across these grounding lines. So it's marching back by a few hundred meters to well over a kilometer a year on average in this region. So it's really, really fast. We also have other data that shows that it's changing really quickly. So on the left-hand side, it's showing kind of the map of what's existing. So this is this gray line here. So the grounding zone I was just showing you before is traced right here. These are some radar data that were taken in 1979 and then again in 2009. So this is just showing change over this like 30-year period. And what they basically could show, what this is essentially showing you, is that this is your 1979 picture, and then these are the two radargrams from more recently. And what you see is that actually the ice shelf is thinned pretty significantly. And so the estimates that they give is somewhere around 50 meters per decade. The estimates that you get from other modeling and stuff is somewhere around 25 to 30 meters per decade. So we're kind of in the 45 to 50, or is what the radar is saying, which is more than the other altimetry data. So we're trying to resolve differences between, are we losing 25 meters a year of ice, or per decade, or are we using something more like 50? So these are the kinds of things we're trying to resolve. And just one more way of looking at it is the role of ocean and atmosphere warming. So this is on the left-hand side. This is showing a few model results from a paper led by Ted Scamvos in 2017. And so this is the glacier system again, Pine Island Glacier right here, Thwaites Glacier right here. And so this is the current where the grounding zone is and where the ice is. And what you'll see is that under just ocean warming, you can see +2 degrees of climate. This is kind of like the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. If there's 2 degrees of warming to the total globe, here's what the ocean warming does to Thwaites Glacier. If it's 3 degrees, you can see it kind of marching back, right? You lose a big chunk of Pine Island. Thwaites starts marching back. At 4 degrees C, you start seeing some really significant change. And then at 5 degrees C, you lose the entire ice sheet. And this is your ice thickness over here. If you combine the ocean and atmosphere warming, it's much faster than that. So you can lose this in just a few degrees C from our current plans. And this is just one model. And one of the hardest things about this is that almost none of the constraints of how this happens are really known. We have very, very little data from underneath the ice shelf telling you how this process happens. So that was really kind of our idea here, was to help try to put error bars on this thing. Just for one final kind of, why is this important to you? This is an aerial picture of New York, of the New York area. So Manhattan, you got Rockaway Park down here, keep your eye out here. My family's from New Jersey, so I was thinking about it in terms of, Jersey City, where my dad grew up. And so you think about, this is the status quo right now. The ice shelf in Thwaites, just the Thwaites system itself, represents somewhere between 0.5 meter and 1 meter of sea level rise. So if you think about what that looks like you're starting to not be able to fly into many of the major airports in New York anymore. You've got significant change. You're starting to actually really affect these coastal communities in the New York area and even inland in New Jersey. And if you do the 3 meters just from the Thwaites Glacier catchment, then you're starting to actually lose chunks of Manhattan, Jersey City, the entire barrier island system in New York and New Jersey is completely gone by that time. So that's just the human cost. We often think about these things as being like these nebulous numbers, but what does a meter of sea level rise look like? And it's not good. This is also just the coastline. You don't think about the impact of storm surges, and extreme weather gets much more damaging as these sea level rise continues. This is where I spent a lot of summers growing up, so I wanted to go and kind of look at this, what happens in various scenarios. This is Seaside Park, New Jersey. Under the same scenario, so around a meter of sea level, and then around 3 meters of sea level. Essentially, the entire area that I grew up in is underwater. So I like to think about this in terms of what these numbers can really mean for people I know, for people that we all probably know. So this isn't like a 100-year scenario, but it's not that far after it, depending on how we make our choices moving forward, which is really back to why these two places are important. There's a lot of unknowns, right? It's not just how warm the atmosphere is and how warm the ocean is that matters. It's how this entire system works. You saw in those pictures that ice streams, have a complicated geometry, that some parts of the continent are not warming as fast as other parts of the continent. And there's multiple different types of effects, and how they add up and influence each other is really key. One of the other things that we don't have is really an understanding of what an average glacier does, because we're just getting to the point that we can observe them in enough detail to even start to untangle that. So how can you look at what's rapid change and know what's different from the baseline scenario? And so this is a kind of an important question that we're also trying to address. And so I'll show you actually data from two ice streams, both related to Western Antarctica. In fact, they would connect. They connect basically over the saddle in West Antarctica. So the Cam ice stream that's right here and is a part of the Ross ice shelf, and then the Thwaites Glacier system that's over here. So I'll show you kind of those two, because they're a really nice story about what a really stable glacier is doing and what a really unstable glacier is doing. So we have kind of a baseline of how to compare them. So we don't overinterpret one or the other. And so this one that we've explored in the Ross ice shelf is cold based. So right now it's warming very, very slightly, if at all, because the grounding zone of this system, the continental shelf is out here, which means the warm water gets advected up here. Maybe it makes it to the front of the ice shelf, but it would take a long time. It takes maybe 20 years for the water from out here to get to the back of this glacier. So it's much less impacted by the currently rapid changes than this system, where the water is making it almost directly onto the continental shelf and straight to the grounding line. So we can compare these two to kind of understand what's going on. They're also in an area that's a little bit different. These are all fast flowing glaciers. The Cam ice stream actually stopped moving 150 years ago. Ice streams can turn on and turn off depending on what's actually happening around them. So if you get one moving faster, you can actually turn another one off, or vice versa. So there's some really interesting dynamics between the individual ice streams that we can also resolve looking at data this way. So we're going to talk a bit about the grounding line of this Ross ice shelf. So think of it as cold based, relatively stable and not moving. And then you've got warm based, fast moving, and probably unstable at Thwaites. So that's the reason to look for both of those. So our perspective on this all comes from Icefin. And so Icefin, I kind of alluded to at the beginning of the talk, but it's our underwater vehicle that we've developed in-house. We're on basically version 3 or 4, depending on how you count them. This is Icefin and the team last field season. So there's me and Icefin, and then members of my research team are these folks here, and right in here. Then over here are our colleagues from the British Antarctic Survey and NYU, who were down helping us. And we also worked with the New Zealand program as well. And so here we're standing on sea ice. So this is about 3 to 4 meters thick, depending on where we're at in McMurdo. This is where we do most of our work. We built our own custom very tall ladder. This thing is like 16 feet tall because Icefin is not short. And then we've got our tent that we hang out in a lot. So everything looks yellow after the end of the season. This is the launch frame. So we kind of like pick this up to get the vehicle vertical, and then we drop it vertically through a hole drilled in the ice. In this case, it's sea ice. So we would just put a drill through, drill a hole, maybe melt it out a little bit or chip it out a little bit. When we're going through ice streams, we've got hundreds to maybe 1,000 meters of ice. So that's done by a hot water drill. And that's what the British Antarctic Survey team is kind of the world's experts in. So this picture was taken in November of 2019, right before both of these field seasons that I'll talk to you about took place. I mentioned that, having this kind of like community of thought and diversity of perspectives is really important. And I think that that's really shown here. Our team is all kind of homegrown. Almost everyone started as a student of some sort on the project, an undergrad, a grad student, and then myself. So we've got engineers and scientists that do engineering and engineers that do science, and then lots of collaborators from various projects. And so last season we were down with the International Thwaites Glacier Collaboration, which was a partnership between the National Science Foundation and the United Kingdom's National Environmental Research Council. So it's the largest field campaign that's ever been attempted in Antarctica, and it took both countries kind of working to get us to Thwaites to make it possible. Just for reference, the Thwaites Glacier system is about 1,200 miles from McMurdo, which is the main base in Antarctica for the U.S. program, and a similar distance from the British station that is up on the peninsula. So there was an overland traverse, there were air traverses, there were stations in the middle in order to make these things happen. So it's a pretty amazing undertaking. We were the first major field season. There was a cruise that happened the year before that, and then it would have continued last season, but of course no Antarctic field work really happened last year because of COVID. So they're hoping to get the second season off this season, COVID and international politics allowing. So the other part of what we did with the Antarctica New Zealand. So we've been collaborating with them, and that's our hope this year, is to continue that, to go back down with their team there. So the University of Otago and Victoria University are both leads in that, and then Antarctica New Zealand itself as well. And then this is the rest of the team. So like I said, we've had undergrads, grad students, postdocs, various faculty members, pretty much people from all over. We've had a couple of high school interns even work with us. So it's been a real homegrown project. So this is Icefin, and basically think of it as a robotic underwater oceanographer. And it's set up, I mentioned that I do planetary science. There's lots of planetary science reasons to do all this. Happy to talk about it in questions, but we really set it up to do Earth science. So here you're seeing Icefin underneath the sea ice. So you can tell it's sea ice, even if you're not an expert in this, by the fact that you can see light coming through the ice. When you're under about 10 meters of ice, there's no more light transmission. So this is just showing the sea ice here is algae kind of growing around, some brinicles, things like that. You can see the snowpack here. So Icefin is about what, 13 feet long and 23 centimeters, or where does that end up being? About 11 or so inches across. And it's designed like that so it can fit through boreholes. When we go to deep field locations, the bigger the hole you have to drill in the ice, the more energy it takes. So the more fuel, the more planes have to bring out even more fuel, bring out every piece of gear, that kind of stuff. So when we built Icefin, this had a sustainability focus in mind. We need a number of people to work with it, but we tried to miniaturize as much as we possibly could and put it in a form factor that would allow us to go through the same holes that were already be drilled for other equipment. A lot of the time when you build something new and fancy with technology, there's a demand on the system to do something new. And we're trying to minimize that by going to this kind of a design. You can see that here is all of these little segments here are modules that come apart. So rather than building one monolithic body like you would for a spacecraft, this entire vehicle comes apart into different modules. And we have the science sensors that are always needed. So there's cameras. So there's a camera top and bottom here, light sources on either side. This is a forward-looking sonar. And then we've got an instrument that measures the oxygen content in the water column. And then this one measures the temperature and salinity of the water column. So all of these are always on the vehicle because they're either safety or global perspective, or just they're the basic instruments that you need to do any oceanography. And so that's why they're up front, and they need undisturbed water flow. The other science sensors in the back are more custom. We can flip things in and out, change the orientation, and do all of that to make things possible. So this is what Icefin looks like underneath. All of the yellow material here is syntactic foam. So essentially that's what keeps it floating. So we put it down vertically by weighting the nose, and then we release the weight and can fly horizontally. So we're what we call a 5 degree of freedom vehicle, which means we can go forward and backwards, we can tip up and down, and we can translate. And the only thing we don't really control is whether the vehicle is rolled or not. So we put all the heavy stuff along the bottom to try to keep it basically floating so that it's not like rotated as we drive along. Then each of these is a kind of a modular payload, and shown at the bottom without the skin on, so you can kind of see the electronics. Many of the sensors we buy off the shelf, but everything in the electronics was developed by our team. And then we have been building custom instruments as well now to put inside the vehicle. So we basically start with the oceanography and imaging kind of perception stuff that I talked about. That's always up in the nose. Then we have directional thrusters. So there's a thruster that comes through the side, and one that's in the vertical direction. Then we have our modular science payload. So here we're showing it with a bathymetric mapping sonar. So basically it gives you the shape of the ocean floor in this package. Down here, this is a side scan sonar, which gives you kind of the shape, but it's not as high resolution as the other sonar. And then these sensors are sensors for pH, turbidity, which is like how much particles or how much particulate there is in the water column. And we can put in like other sensors, like looking for chlorophyll or looking for kind of dissolved organic matter as a kind of biogeochemical study of what's going on underneath the ice. And this sensor bay can either be pointed up towards the ice or down towards the seafloor. For most of the instruments, with the bathymetric sonar, it's a little too heavy. We can't actually rotate it up yet. Coming soon, hopefully. And then again, in the back, we can do the same thing. So in the back, we have what's called a Doppler velocity logger. That's this sensor here. What it does is it sends out like sonar pings and tells us how fast we're moving over the seafloor. It's coupled there. There's an inertial measurement unit. So the same thing like in your cell phone, like it tells your phone what direction it's facing. They're in lots of different types of instruments, but we have an inertial measurement unit. So that tells us what attitude we're in. And then the DVL here tells us how fast we're moving in that attitude. And if you put those together, that's essentially our navigation under the ice. So we navigate relative to where we drop through the ice. Here you can see this is actually a camera and another light source pointed in the other direction. We actually now have it so that the light's back here and the camera's right here. So it's kind of illuminated in a different direction. So we can image things really close to the seafloor or up at the ice-ocean interface if we rotate the module. And then this is an altimeter, which is basically sending out one ping, just giving us either the ice profile or the seafloor profile, depending on what orientation we're in. Then we've got our directional thrusters and our main thruster. It's forward and back. And we also now have added our backup camera, which is fantastic. We can watch the tether and actually do some science facing backwards too, which has been really cool. And then inside here, there's 20 lithium ion batteries. They're really fairly small. And then the custom electronics, the computers and everything that's driving Icefin. And then we communicate to it over a tether. So we get the data back even if the vehicle was to get stuck one day. So all in all, it's pretty cool. It's kind of a hybrid AUV ROV, which means it can do some autonomous stuff, but we're mostly driving it live over the tether. So, or supervised autonomy is another way to think about it when we do autonomous functions. We've put over 175 hours under the ice, 41 missions, and over 85 kilometers of transects under the ice, which is pretty great, since before the vehicle existed, there were none or very close to none. There's one other vehicle that's operated under Pine Island, that's a long range AUV, much larger. So the cool thing about Icefin, as I mentioned, is that it's modular. It comes apart into pieces that we can easily put on small planes and take it out to the deep field. And it has as many science sensors as these big ocean vehicles do, but it only weighs about 200 pounds. So it saves a huge amount on fuel costs as well. There's all the science sensors. We don't need to talk about those necessarily. Here's Icefin doing its job underneath the sea ice. So swimming around and taking lots of different measurements. So it's kind of what it looks like when it's working. And so this is really what we've been doing for the last couple of years with our work in Antarctica. So I'm going to show you now the kind of two ice stream case studies. The first is the one that we did with the New Zealand program last year, and that is the CAM ice stream. So remember, I was talking about that France-sized ice shelf that's cold-based and relatively stable. So that's this system. So this is kind of showing where we normally work. We've done a lot of work around in this orange circle. Our colleagues went to this location, which unfortunately we got fogged out of. That was a real bummer. But we did make it out to the last location out at the grounding zone of CAM. And so what we're looking for is how the conditions are changing. So I mentioned, right, we're trying to understand what's going on underneath the ice shelf. So there's these forces out in the front of the ice shelf that are different from what's going on at the back. And each one of them has a fingerprint. So the normal surface water, or the water that's up closest to the ice, is called ice shelf water. It's usually below the in situ freezing point or very close to its in situ freezing point. And then you get high salinity shelf water that's at the bottom. That's being formed by sea ice formation and salt rejection. And then that kind of mixes and comes underneath here. And in the cases where you have circumpolar deep water, it would be down in this region as well. In the Ross Ice Shelf, we mostly have ice shelf water and some high salinity shelf water that's being produced. But what you can see here is this is the temp salinity and the temperature that tell us which water mass that we're dealing with. And you can see that it's mirrored in the dissolved oxygen, right? There's kind of a loop here, and then there's a very strong change in that behavior here. And so these are the signatures that we're looking for when we look underneath the ice. And it changes as you go back underneath the ice shelf. And so we're looking to kind of put this picture all the way across the system. So this is where we went. This is kind of a zoom in, a surface image of the CAM ice stream. This red area was the survey area. And these are, this is a radar detection of cracks in the bottom of the ice shelf, fairly far actually upstream from where we were operating. So we were actually, back here where none of the cracks were resolved. So there's some really, really monstrous cracks kind of downstream from here. And then we are out, we basically drilled very, very close. And this next season, we're trying to drill over here on a channel. So this is the team that was out there. The other challenge of last season was it was the first time that we had two deep field activities. Deep field basically means anywhere farther out than McMurdo. So we actually had to build a second robot and break the team in half. Half the team went with the New Zealand program, half the team went with the British program to do these two seasons at the same time. So there's Icefin, as you can see, usually a very warm day in Antarctica. These are icicles actually dripping off the vehicle. This is the team that was out there. So collecting the data. And this is the data from the vehicle. So KIS-1, this is the borehole. So this dotted line right here is actually where we dropped the vehicle. And all of this data here, which looks like, okay, this is boring. This is a big white plot with some blue stuff underneath it. But this information wasn't known until this point. And so this is actually the ice elevation. And you can see these basal fractures here. These are crevasses in the bottom of the ice shelf, and these are all measured from Icefin. And this is the topography of the seafloor, also measured by Icefin. So those sensors are actually mapping the water column, which wasn't really known. And actually, you can't even resolve it when it's this shallow very well with radar or seismic. So we can put these really cool, very detailed constraints on the geometry. This is kind of zooming in to look at what this means for the ocean, and it's colorized for what's called thermal driving. So thermal driving is essentially the temperature above freezing. So the freezing point of water is pressure dependent. So it's a different point in the deep ocean than it is, deep under the ice than it is at the surface. So here we're basically very slightly colder. You notice this is 0.05. So 0.05 Celsius is the difference here. So very, very tiny amount of thermal driving. So this is above freezing by about 2 or 3 times that, and then I guess 5 times that in this region. So we've got a little bit of warmer water and a little bit of colder water overlaying it. And so you have colder, a little bit fresher water, and then warm water underneath it. And warm is very, very relative. This is still extremely, extremely cold water, still almost -2. And so what this is actually showing is that the warm water is coming in, it's melting the ice a little bit, making this colder and fresher in the upper water column. So we can actually understand how that's going on. But you notice these are very, very slight differences. So that's the first thing that we can do. The other neat thing that we did was to go up inside a crevasse and look at some of these processes. What you can see here is the textures that are caused by melting inside the crevasse. That's these kind of like dimpled features here. And I'll show you these again underneath underneath weight. So even here where we have a tiny, tiny amount of heat, very, very little above freezing, it's still able to actually melt the ice. But because it's so cold, if you look in this lower picture, you kind of see this white kind of pockmarked surface. And then this upper picture on the right-hand side, you notice that it's kind of greenish in color. This is actually melted water running uphill, freezing new ocean water, essentially, just a little bit of ocean water onto the side of the crevasse. And what that green color is it's actually like a little bit of the salt, a little bit of the iron, a little bit of the material from the ocean actually being frozen on and refilling in this crack. So it's a whole dynamic process that we really don't even understand, but it's happening in this kind of cycle inside the crevasses. So that's really an exciting kind of smaller story. What that looks like when you kind of pull apart the anatomy of a crevasse is that you can see evidence of melting differently, even in just this little feature. So we've got strong evidence of melting. That's like this golf ball looking texture here. Those are melt cusps from the turbulent water column kind of melting away the ice shelf. You can see that it continues above that, and then it kind of gradates. And as the water gets colder, when it gets to actually above or below the freezing point, then you start to see this accretion, and this is forming new ice at the very top of the crevasse. So the crevasse is opened by the glacier breaking, and then as some of this melted water gets stuck in the crevasse and goes uphill, it then refreezes and kind of fills in the crack at the top. So it's kind of neat. The reason that we probably couldn't see these features right away was because they've been filled in by this ocean process. And it looks a little bit different on each side. But this is really cool. And so this is kind of the anatomy of how a crevasse works, which hadn't been seen before, but it's also the anatomy of how a cold-based glacier system really works. So we get a lot of information about the history of the glacier. We can actually see that these imprints, this is now looking at sonar data from the seafloor, is actually from the ice touching down and then coming back off. And so in the last 150 years since this glacier stopped moving, it's basically slowly melted off. And during part of that time has been occasionally touching down on the seafloor. Probably that happened maybe 100 years ago. And so we've just been watching it slowly open this ocean cavity. So it's kind of cool. So we can kind of resolve the whole history of this relatively easy to understand system. And so it tells you kind of what a typical glacier would look like if it wasn't being forced by the climate, right? We've got a relatively cold ocean, 2-layer system. We've got some melting, but just a tiny amount of it. And then that melts kind of redistributed into the upper water column and a little bit into refreezing. We understand a little bit better how crevasses work, and we can see the history of the ice stream actually recorded in the seafloor. So all of those measurements are not possible if you don't take a vehicle and actually put it down where this is going. So this is really good grounding, literally grounding for other grounding zones where they may be more dynamic. And so that's the second half of the story is, what does it look like? Okay, now we know what a normal cold base, not moving system looks like. What does it look like when we get to this one that we're worried about? So this is that picture again. This is all of the planned investigations over 4 years of the ITGC. Ours was really focused right at the grounding zone. So we're the only one really focused at the grounding zone. There's stuff happening upstream. There's stuff happening out in the ocean cavity. We're really focused up there. So this is the part of the system. If you think back to that picture that was showing you how much the glacier is changing over time, this is that picture. So this is the remaining ice shelf. So this is the disintegrated part of the main trunk that used to exist. Out here is where that pinning point is, like where the rise is and the ice is kind of sitting on the top. And then we were exploring this area that we call the butterfly, which is one of the regions where the grounding zone is moving the fastest backwards. And it's pretty typical of the entire coastline, is also really important. So there's this really fast moving area way over here. It's unsafe. We can't really camp there. We couldn't do a lot of the work that we wanted to do there. It's the coolest because it's happening the fastest, but it's also terrifying over there. So here we're working in a place that's a little bit safer, but also is more typical of the entire coastline than that one fast moving area. So it's also kind of an interesting case study there too. This is the team out at the field site. So this is our setup again. This is the setup that actually where the hot water drill goes over the top, which is basically just a hose, high pressure water hose, relatively warm water, drilling out the hole here. We'd kind of slide one onto the hole, do the drilling, slide that back, then slide the Icefin gear over, dive with the vehicle, slide it off, let the other instruments go down, then do a new dive. So that was kind of how our operations worked. Here's a picture of us putting Icefin in the water. So tents, this is where we were living, little tents in the background. And then our work tent was over here, same frame, and that's Andy and myself. This is what it looks like to work inside the tent. So this is our first dive. We've got the cameras that are looking down the hole in front of us, so you can kind of see we're up in the snow at this point. And then this is the backup cam looking backwards. This would be another feed from our down camera, but we have it turned off when we're going down the hole. And then the sonar screen is over here, and I'm very excited, as it turns out. This is the same picture, but now kind of showing terrible versions. But basically that very first picture that I showed with you, the very first slide, that shape of the ice topography is in this upper right-hand picture. And this is the sonar record showing that, 20 meters out from the robot is where the ice is sitting on the seafloor. So this was like our most exciting moment to get back to this place and try to figure it all out. So this is how the dives went. So we actually did 5 science dives. Each one is colorized here. So the first one we did is this pink line, which is about 1 kilometer. This green line, dive 17, was almost 2. So we almost made it to where the grounding line, it was probably somewhere in this region. Then we went back out towards the open ocean. And then we did another ride here along dive 20. We actually intersect the grounding line. And then we did one more open ocean direction. So this, like I said, this track is basically the one that we followed as a project. There's also GPR, so ground penetrating radar, and ice penetrating radar from planes flown over the same line. And then we have some radar sensors that also measure change in the area. So what did Icefin see? Let's take a look at these 3 dives. So this is kind of the video from the picture that I showed at the beginning of the talk. So this is the shape of the ice, and you can see the rocks and stuff that I mentioned. You can see kind of the topography here. And what you're going to see come up to meet us is the seafloor. And so I'm driving the robot really close to the ice, and then you can see the seafloor right here, and you can really see the contact between the ice and the seafloor back in the back of this image. And so this is really why that picture that I showed at the beginning of the talk means so much to me, is that it's really showing this really exciting environment, which had never been seen before until this point. So let's get into what the data is showing us. Now let's think back to just the last example I showed. And I said, look at all this action just with 0.05 of thermal driving, right? 0.05 degrees. You'll notice there's a very different temperature regime here. We have up to 2.25 degrees of thermal driving. It's really significantly different. This is a very, very fast moving system. Very, very warm. Even up close to the ice, where these blue colors are, we're still talking about a degree above freezing. So significantly more than we were in the cold base glacier, which is why it's really hard to resolve exactly what's going on. What's important here is that we didn't necessarily know what the geometry looked like. So here's the ice elevation. So all this gray material up here is the ice. This black line here is measured from the altimeter. So these are crevasses in the ice, and then this is the topography of the ice shelf. And the first thing you should notice is that it's pretty different. So here's the dives. So we had those 2 dives that I mentioned, dive 16 and dive 17 cover this region. Dive 19 covers this region in the other direction. This is kind of the context for this dive. But this is the seafloor. And this is the warm circumpolar deep water actually making it all the way back essentially to this level, which means that this warm water is accessing the grounding zone pretty easily. And this is moving back every year, but it looks like that's still sufficient for a lot of this warm water to get over the top. And even though only 1.5 degree water is up right against the ice shelf, that's still significant, right? Remember that the other ice shelf was melting even though there was 0.05 degrees. So there's still a lot of action going on here. So we're very close to the grounding zone here. I mentioned crevasses, but one of the really cool things is if you look at what the topography looks like of the ice shelf here and here, it's very, very different. And these turn out to be formed from melting of features that look like this to then become these kind of flat terraces. And that's really an important part of what we observed underneath it. And then the other thing is that we can actually find previous locations where we think that the grounding zone actually was located. So as I mentioned, it's been moving back on average 1 kilometer or so per year. It usually does it kind of in spurts. So it'll hold up on one place for a little while and then recede back. And so we think that these are actually 3 former grounding zone positions that we see in the data. So the ice was stable in one position and now it's moved back. So we can actually confirm that. And then looking at the data where we made it all the way back to the grounding zone, it doesn't really change the story. Most of the warm water is making it, even though we had to kind of drive uphill in this location to get to the grounded ice. There's still really warm water making it all the way back. Something else pretty cool is that the vehicle can measure current. So we actually have a measurement of how fast the water column is in this area. So it's moving kind of in and out of the page. Into the page and out of the page, red or blue. And so we can actually kind of see this estuarian circulation. So the water's kind of curling around in this area. And we can measure speeds up to greater than 3 centimeters per second, which isn't very fast, but it's enough to actually do some really interesting things. We can also measure what's happening all the way up to the interface, and then that it's actually behaving differently inside the crevasses. We actually see the current speed almost double inside the crevasses, which means that it's moving faster, it's bringing more water, more warm water along it, and that warm water actually makes it to the walls of the crevasse. And so the crevasses are actually the fastest melting part of the system, which was really cool to actually be able to observe. This terracing thing is pretty cool. So these are what I mean by a terrace. It's places where you get very vertical melt faces and then very horizontal kind of ceilings. So this is actually like a wedge of ice, and each one of those, that's a fish right there. You can kind of see this fish here. Each one of these features is probably between 10 and 30 centimeters in size, those cusps. And then you'll notice this very, very strong, very, very flat interface here, and there was a flat interface at the top. What this is really showing you is that the melting is really efficient going sideways and not super efficient going vertically. So this is a really cool fundamental observation that we now actually have really good in situ data for. And it changes how we think about it. So this is data from our forward-looking sonar showing that same feature. So it's kind of got this really pointed feature here, and these walls that are being actively melted. And so we're trying to figure out how things like this form. Here's a zoom in of those melt textures, similar to what we saw in the other data set, and you can kind of see them. So this is where we can measure kind of the size and scale of these little melt features. So tens of centimeters, somewhere around the 30 centimeter or so scale. And this is really neat because it now gives us the ability to not only take pictures of this to see what the radar would see from above, but we can also now, instead of just measuring the overall temperature of the water column, we can measure the water temperature, the topography of the ice, the salinity of the ice-ocean interface. And we can look for mixing, and we can look for how these processes happen. And that's really what this is showing. So the little stars here, so this is the track of the vehicle. So these kind of colored lines, this is the vehicle going up to the ice, up to the ice, up to the ice. And the little blue, sorry, that's the blue line is basically temperature. And then the stars are individual points along that data. And so that's showing you how warm it is. So like I said, over a degree above its in situ freezing point, even right here at the grounding zone. So very, very, very warm. It's relatively fresh, but not super fresh, which means that it's actually melting pretty quickly and being the water's kind of moving away. And then we know how much oxygen is in the water column as well. So it kind of helps us see if these are different places or what are the dynamics. In the terraces, it's something very different where you have very, 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 very warm water, and then all of a sudden it jumps to the left, and you get very fresh, very stratified water column. And so this is really showing you why you get these vertical faces and then very, very flat tops, which wasn't expected, or at least wasn't ever really described. And then this happens basically all over the cavity. The reason that that's cool is that it means that you can take features like this. This is now back to the forward-looking sonar. What you're seeing is you're seeing like folds. So you're seeing like basically, if you imagine a fan shape, right? Like, you know, the way a fan has all these multiple folds, that's what the ice looks like. And that very first picture I showed you, that's like a fan, like a fold in the ice. So it's like little features that are kind of up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. And by the time they're in the ocean for, you know, a few months, they start to look like a vertical face and a horizontal face. And that's the action of the melting, and how it's more efficient going sideways. So all of that stuff is really new dynamics. And it means that the ice is melting differently than we have ever modeled before.
So Brittany, so I know you said you had to go right at 4, and
Yeah,
the hour's gone really quickly. So just to let you know what it's about 5 till now, just to let you know.
Sure, thank you very much. So this is actually my last science slide, which is basically building towards all of this stuff. And what it's showing you is that slope that I had showed earlier. This is the amount of time that the ice has been in the ocean. So you can see it's really rough, and kind of the slope is all over the place. when it's new. And then by the time you get out and you've been in the ocean for, a few years, it's very flat or very horizontal. Very flat or very vertical. It's kind of like these two different benchmarks. And what it's actually showing us is that the ice shelf is melting differently. So even though we kind of estimate our melting on average to be around 2 meters per year, there are regions of the ice that are melting much, much faster than this. This is a really conservative estimate, but it shows that part of the ice is melting at, 6 to 10, maybe more meters per year. So it's actually losing a lot more than we can actually measure vertically. So this is kind of the new story that's coming out, is that this topography on the bottom of the ice shelf actually has a lot to do with how much ice we lose. And so it's a new factor we have to actually consider in models. So preliminary conclusions, like I said, this is kind of all a work in progress, but is that we really do see this very warm ocean with a stratified boundary layer. We're showing this current flowing westward through the grounding zone, really different ice properties depending on what's going on in the ocean and depending on what's going on upstream. And that this complex feedback between topography and melting is everywhere. The reason that that's new is that some of this process has been talked about before, but it's always been for very specific places rather than the entire base of the ice. So a melt behavior that we had really thought was maybe taking up 1% or 2% or something of the volume of the ice is actually maybe, at least at the grounding zone, 100% of what's going on. And so that process has to be taken into account. And so that's kind of the cool takeaway from this. So it doesn't really answer how fast this is happening, but it answers the question on what dynamics we're missing in the models that we have today. So that's it. I'd be happy to answer a few questions, and I can also answer some questions. I could probably stay till about 4:05, and then I could be happy to answer questions over email or if we don't get to everything. So
great. Well, thank you so much for a fascinating talk. And there are a bunch of questions in the Q&A.
Sure.
If you want to look, and you can stay till 4:05, that's great. And for the students listening here, you can leave earlier if you want to, but lots of good questions in the Q&A.
Yeah. So it says, let's see, is it possible?
Do you see it, or do you want me to read some to you?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we can kind of go through a whole bunch.
Okay.
So one of the questions that I think is a really good one says, is it possible to explain how just a few hundred cubic kilometers of ice can raise total sea level by meters, even when the area of the Earth is pretty large? It's because a meter isn't that much. If you think about just how much ice we're talking about here. So the volumes that I quoted, 3 meters of sea level rise, is taking the volume of ice that would be removed. And if you took that volume of ice, made it liquid water, and distributed it over the ocean, right? So in those estimates, we've done that, right? So we've said, here's the surface area of the ocean, here's the amount of ice, and that's just how much ice it is. So in some places, this ice is 3 kilometers thick, and it's thousands of kilometers long. And so that's a massive amount of water, right? So when you start to lose those features very quickly, it adds up. And then the real worry isn't necessarily one exact iceberg or something coming off, which that's like a human attention zone or attention span kind of problem. Is like, oh, a big chunk of ice just carved off. But that ice has already been contributing. When you see a big iceberg calve off, that ice has already contributed to sea level, right? The second it entered the ocean. What you don't see is how the upstream ice changes in response to that. So what tends to happen is, as you remove ice from the front, the rest of it speeds up, so it can flow faster, and so then you're just increasing the amount of ice over time. So those volumes are accurate for the surface area of the of the Earth. And that's because this is a massive amount of ice. They're huge. France, but 4 kilometers deep, that's what we're talking about. How long can Icefin stay submerged without any interference? We can basically run until the batteries die. And that just depends on how long and how we're operating the vehicle. So if we're just kind of cruising and the currents are really low, and we're not doing a whole bunch of sonar or changing elevation or any of that stuff, it could go 8 or 10 hours probably. Most of the dives are around 6. And we tend to drive it out to our goal and then pull it back using the tether to try to save battery power so we can do as much science as possible. It's also actually it's scarier in some ways because you're dragging the vehicle back on the tether. But it's also a lot safer because we don't get the tether snagged as much as we do when we drive around. So hopefully, infinite power, better batteries, that would be really nice. Is there any discussion about using Icefin and a non-Earth system like Europa? Yeah, I mean, that's its goal, is to help us with climate science. We're trying to get to these really hard to get to places. And then we're testing instruments like water samplers and different sensors and CTDs. And we have a holographic microscope and a bunch of other stuff that we've built for the vehicle to kind of test the types of technologies that we might need to one day do this on Europa. So our hypothesis is that it took us 100 years of driving cars on the Earth before we put one on Mars. And so if we have a similar process going on Earth, then we really need to accelerate our use of AUVs and ROVs under the ice in order to make that possible one day. Let's see. So hopefully, it says, how have I been able to compare the changes underwater with factors on land or over the ice? Yeah, so actually the melt rates that we are getting from the in situ data, from going up to the ice ocean interface and measuring it directly, those kind of melt rates actually match with the radar data and not with the altimetry data, which is more of a global average. So we see more melting than any of the kind of more biased techniques see, which is a little bit upsetting because we would have really liked to see less melting. But it's just different melting as well. So exactly how that works is still kind of work in progress. And then, is it more important to look at glaciers and ice shelves in Antarctica than the ones in the Northern Hemisphere? No, absolutely not. You have to do both. The problem is that most of the change that we have already signed up for most of the change in the Northern Hemisphere. And Antarctica, we understand a lot less. We just have a lot less data because we don't live there. It's hard to get there. It's a real challenge. And the contribution of Antarctica to global sea level rise is around, it's like 20 or 30% right now. So most of it is coming from change in Greenland and the Canadian Arctic, and then in northern Russia, or from mountain glaciers. But mountain glaciers are basically almost dead at this point. So they changed first. So they were the big impact early on. Ice shelves in the Arctic collapsed in the last 100 years. And so a lot of the change was pretty much direct. Antarctica has been saved from some of this by that isolating effect, but as it increases, it also has much more sea level rise. So like all of Greenland is something like 7 or 8 meters of sea level rise, which is a ton, and we should be terrified. But like one part of Antarctica is that much, right? Like West Antarctica, that whole area we were just talking about, has almost twice the sea level rise potential as Greenland. So that's why it's important to make sure we do both, because they're both changing, and that one's going to be the one that stays around the longest, because Greenland's we've signed up for a lot of the change in Greenland. Let's see, how does sonar, so far we don't really interact, and we're not in any areas that are strong, like there's not like lots of whales or anything way deep underneath the ice. We're not exactly in those same frequencies. We're not active sonar like with like where we're trying to communicate, so it's not it's not as disruptive as like the geophysical exploration, for example. But we do have very interested seals. So seals will come check us out when they're already down underneath the ice. They kind of ignore us, but they will see you, like you've got lights and stuff on. So they'll come over and check us out sometimes, but so far not really, don't seem to be negatively impacted at all. They just kind of go about their business. And then let's see, let's do one more. Why did I start doing this research? And well, I initially got really interested in radars for planets. And so I was really excited about trying to learn how to use ice penetrating radar on places like Europa, and then got down to Antarctica working on airborne geophysics. So geophysics from a plane rather than from a spacecraft, and just realized how much more there was to do there. So got really excited about doing it. So anyway, so yeah, I guess I'll have to run at that point. But if we wanted to take these other questions down, I'd be happy to email folks.
Okay, well, thanks so much for really exciting, interesting talk. Is really inspiring to think about this robot going under the ice. And welcome you to Cornell once you make it up here. And thanks so much for your time. Really appreciated it.